Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Chilombo and I'll be in the background answering any of your technical questions today. Before we begin, I'd like to invite our speakers to say a quick hello.
Hello.
Brody.
Hey, everyone.
Michaela.
Hello, everyone.
So Danielle, the floor is yours.
Great. Hello. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this live session today on climate resilient infrastructure. My name is Danielle Imperato, and I'm part of McKinsey's sustainability practice. I'll be your moderator for today. And now I'm very excited to introduce our presenters for today. First up, we'll have Brody Boland, an associate partner out of our Washington, D.C. office. He is a leader of McKinsey's work on climate risk in the real estate and infrastructure sectors. He has advised several cities on climate adaptation strategies, including improving infrastructure resilience to flood, fire, heat, and other hazards. He has also advised on the integration of physical adaptation and mitigation measures into economic growth, mobility, and other socioeconomic objectives. We also have today Dr. Mekhala Krishnan, a senior fellow at the McKinsey Global Institute, McKinsey's business and economics research arm. Her research focuses on various topics related to inclusive growth and economic development, including climate risk, globalization, productivity growth in advanced economics, and women's role in labor markets. Her most recent research focuses on the near-term impact of physical climate risk across sectors and geographies, including its implications for companies and countries. She is a frequent speaker on these topics at global conferences, as well as with executives at Fortune 500 companies. So I am very, very excited to turn our session over to Brody, who will kick us off for today.
Great. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you all for joining. This is a WebEx, so unfortunately we don't have everyone in the same room together, and the opportunity for kind of discussion is somewhat limited. But within the constraints of this format, we would love this to be as interactive as possible, right? So if you do have questions, please ask them. Don't wait to the end. We'll stop along the way and try and answer the easy ones at least. If we go forward a page or a couple pages. So in terms of how we're going to spend our time over the next hour, we're going to start with a little bit of a just overview of climate risk. And I know looking at the participant list, there are probably many of you are familiar with at least the outlines of that, but we wanted to ground the discussion in just some of the fundamental dynamics of physical climate risk and what our research over the past couple of years has shown about that. So that's where we'll start, and then we'll move into a deep dive on climate risk in infrastructure, and a few things we'll talk about on the infrastructure side. So one, we'll talk about just what the exposure, what the risk is for the infrastructure system. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we can do about it, right? What we can do about it from an adaptation perspective. How do we actually prepare ourselves to meet those risks, and what we can do about it from a mitigation perspective. What the infrastructure system can do to help our economy and our society decarbonize and prevent the worst of climate change. So that's the kind of arc of the discussion. We'll have a few points in here where we'll, be asking some polls just to try and, hear from all of you on your experience, what's happening in your organizations. And again, we'd love, if you have questions, please enter them as we go, and we'll do our best to answer them. Just to start with the bad news, the first part of the session will be a bit of the bad news. So, we like to start these conversations by having a bit of a reality check to disabuse ourselves of the notion that physical climate risk is somehow a future thing, that it's somehow dealt with by our our grandchildren. Physical climate risk, and Mekhala will talk about this in some more detail, is here. While we can't attribute any one event to climate change, the increased frequency and severity of these events we can, right? And we're seeing these events happen. We've seen in the infrastructure system oil terminals damaged. We're seeing, water treatment plants having to close for extended periods of time. We're seeing power plants overheat or, transmission distribution systems be cut off by wildfires or extreme heat. Airports have to suspend operations because of heat or flooding or wind. And so these are having already a very material impact on the economics of infrastructure assets, but also importantly, of course, on the services that those infrastructure assets provide to citizens. And so, this is already here. It is going to increase, and we want to spend the next hour or so talking about what we can do about it. So if we go to the next page, this is we'll start with a bit of a poll, and I think we can open the poll now. There we are. You'll hopefully see it on the right-hand side of your screen, and a friendly little countdown timer to encourage everyone to vote quickly. So the question here is, how important is climate risk in your organization's agenda? Is it one of the top priorities? It's discussed in the boardroom. It's on the strategic agenda. Is it just on the agenda? So people are talking about it, but it, hasn't quite made the top of the list. Discussed, but not a priority. So people may be, discussing it on the edges of meetings or in the hallways, but it hasn't really hasn't really been elevated to the level of the organization. Or maybe it's not even discussed. I think, I know some of the folks from the participant list are not from kind of large, corporations, right? You may be from academic organizations, semi-governmental organizations. So, feel free to answer this however it makes sense, given your unique context. And I think the results should show in, 15 or 20 seconds, so we can do a little, Jeopardy song or something in the meantime. Okay, interesting. So yeah, well, this is a good crowd. That's good. That's good news. So it looks like for about a third of organizations, it's actually one of the top priorities, which I would say kind of tilts probably, more, towards the kind of higher priority than we typically see when we ask these questions. And then almost half it's on the agenda with, very few folks saying it's discussed but not a priority or hardly even discussed. So that's promising news. I think we probably have a little bit of maybe a biased sample given who shows up to these events, but that's great to hear. Why don't we flip to the next one? So this question, if we open up the polling, hopefully everyone can see. Yeah, it's opened up. So, and you can I believe enter multiple answers to this question if you'd like. This is a question around whether there's been pressure from stakeholders. So are there, for example, investors sending you questionnaires, asking about your climate risk exposure, whether that be physical risk or transition risk? Are your customers asking questions? Are you seeing changes in kind of buying patterns? Are employees or people you're trying to recruit, saying that it's actually important to see some action from your organization on climate risk for them to want to work there? Obviously, there's kind of regulatory, government pressure, activists and others, or potentially no pressure. And I think what we often see here is this obviously depends a lot on the sector, but, there's been an enormous change over the past, call it year or so in terms of pressure from these stakeholder groups. Some of the main changes, so it's reflected here, right? You're seeing almost 50% of organizations are getting pressure from investors, from customers, say a third from employees, 60% from regulators and governments, which is really interesting. A quarter from activists. What we've observed, we've asked these same questions often when we have these events, right? And I remember about a year ago, we were with a group of infrastructure investors asking these questions. And I think since then, there's been a real inflection point in terms of the pressure, especially from investor community on climate risk. So some of the major institutional investors starting to ask these questions, demand that there's some transparency into the climate risk that their investments are exposed to. And so I would expect and I would imagine that a lot of folks on the webinar today have had the similar experience with just the real shift in the landscape in terms of the number of stakeholders that are really asking serious questions about climate risk. So that was just to kind of start us off. We wanted to get a sense as to how important it is. It sounds like it's on the agenda for most of your organizations. It sounds like you're having to answer questions from your stakeholder groups. So I'll hand over to Mekhala to talk, ground us in the actual fundamentals of physical climate risk.
Great, thanks, Brody. So what we wanted to do is to give you all just a quick tour of the types of risks one could experience from climate change more broadly as we think about socioeconomic systems. And then Brody will dive more deeply into infrastructure specifically. But let's start with what the science tells us. What this chart is showing is what climate science tells us about the degree to which the Earth has warmed. And essentially across the board, virtually, we see that parts of the Earth have warmed relative to pre-industrial times. Now, that degree of warming varies across different parts of the Earth. And I think that's really the reason we put this slide up. The fact is that while the Earth has warmed, almost more important is the fact that it's warmed differently in different parts of the planet. So location matters as we think about understanding exposures to physical risk. Typically, as we've thought about things like infrastructure design, things like financial modeling and capital allocations, we don't usually think about this notion of space in these decisions and how risks might look different in different parts of the world. So it's very important now to bring a new toolkit to bear, this understanding of space, as we think about financial modeling, economic modeling, engineering modeling, and design going forward. So that's one aspect of climate risk. If we move to the next slide, you'll see another aspect of climate risk, which is the fact that climate risk is all about probabilities. What this chart is showing in the white line is temperatures in the northern hemisphere in the 60s to 80s. And then the blue line is the distribution of temperatures more recently. And so a few things stand out as we look at this. The first, of course, is that the distribution has shifted to the right. This means on average, we're experiencing warmer days. But what we also see is this shaded blue area on the very right. And what that means is that events that were very low probability events, in this case, we've chosen to highlight what used to be a 0.2% likelihood event, is now occurring with a 15% probability. So by this measure of risk, we've seen a 75 times increase in risk in the last 50 years. Now, the reason that matters is that when we think about the various systems that underpin our lives, everything from insurance to infrastructure assets, they're all designed to withstand certain events of certain thresholds. We use nomenclature like a 100-year event, a 50-year event, a 200-year event, events that have, say, a 1% probability, a 0.5% probability. But that very probability, what constitutes these 100-year events, is likely to change, indeed has already changed as a result of climate change going forward. So as we think about the range of socioeconomic systems that underpin our lives, the design thresholds of these systems now need to be thought of in different ways as the climate changes, as what constitutes these severe events, these tail events, starts to shift. Events that were low probability events are now occurring with ever-increasing likelihood. So if we move to the next slide, what that essentially results is in two different forms of what we call climate risk. The first and the focus of this conversation is physical risk. It's essentially the risk that arises as different climatic events, both acute and chronic, occur, say, with greater frequency or with greater severity, and the knock-on effects that has in a variety of socioeconomic systems. There is also, of course, transition risk. As we think about managing these climate change events and the economy transitions towards a low carbon footprint, that could in turn create transition risk for a variety of sectors. As I said, we'll focus most of this discussion on the left side. There's also a third form of risk, which is around liability risks as a result of the climate transition. But really, the focus of this discussion is on the physical risk side of things. If we move to the next slide, let's try and understand why physical risk actually impacts different socioeconomic systems. So oftentimes, as we think about the economic modeling of physical risk, the way that people have approached this is to say that we experience small increases in temperature, small changes in climate that could result in correspondingly small increases in socioeconomic impacts. But what our analysis finds is that's not really the right way to think about this problem. as we look to understand the impacts of physical climate change, it's very important to understand the thresholds of different types of systems, whether that's the human body, food systems, or physical assets, the design parameters of these systems that may mean that impacts could be nonlinear. If you think about the building that we're all in, or if you think about, as an example of a physical system, or an infrastructure asset, or where we grow our crops, all of these systems have essentially been optimized for a stable climate. And as the climate changes, even by small amounts, the design thresholds of these systems could be breached in a way that we could see significant nonlinear impacts. So let's look at a few examples of that. In the middle, if we think about food systems as one example, this is showing the reproductive growth rate of maize or corn. And what you see is that above about 20 degrees Celsius, we start to see a dramatic decline in the reproductive growth rate. So if corn grows today in areas that are optimized for that 20 degrees optimal reproductive growth rate, as the climate shifts, even by small amounts, we can start to breach thresholds of this particular system such that we start to see a decline in reproductive growth rates. The same is also true when we think about the human body. The human body is essentially evolved to function optimally within certain temperature parameters. Above a certain core body temperature on the left here, 42 degrees Celsius, exposure beyond a few hours, 4 to 5 hours, could mean that a healthy human being is essentially at risk of fatality. Even before that fatal condition is reached, the human body's productivity under heat and humidity conditions starts to fall. We need to take more frequent breaks. We may work less productively. So all to say that the human body as well is a system that has evolved for a certain temperature, and as those temperature and humidity conditions change, human productivity, human ability to live, work outdoors could get affected. And then finally, on the very right, probably most relevant for this discussion is an example of a physical asset and the damage that that physical asset experiences as a result of flooding. And what you see here is from about 1 meter to 3 meters of flooding, of course, there's an increase in damage of the asset from about 15% to 30%. But in this particular example, post 3 meters, there's a dramatic increase in the kinds of damage, the magnitude of damage this asset experiences. So as we look to understand the impacts that climate change could have, it's very important to understand the thresholds, the design parameters of these systems that exist around us, physical systems in these examples, but equally financial systems, insurance systems, social systems that may be breached as a result of even small increases or small changes in the climate. So let's see what that means for examples of different systems. We looked at 5 different types of systems: livability and workability, which is essentially the human system, 2 examples of natural systems, food systems on the one hand, and then natural capital on the other hand, and then 2 examples of physical systems, both physical assets themselves, things like buildings or factories, as well as infrastructure assets, which we thought about separately, not just because of the fact that the assets themselves could be damaged, but infrastructure assets being damaged can have knock-on effects in broader economic activity. So what we find is that as the climate changes, each of these 5 systems could be affected. And that matters when we think about growth and economic activity, because these are essentially the factors of production in an economy. From an economic standpoint, we think about land and natural capital. We think about human capital and physical capital as the factors from which we derive all productive activity. And each of these 5 systems could be affected in various ways as a result of a changing climate. They could both be damaged. So, for example, an infrastructure asset or a physical asset fundamentally being damaged. They could also be disrupted. So, for example, as heat conditions rise, as Brody will talk about, potentially loss of efficiency on things like the power system. So it's both damage to the system itself as well as potential disruptions. And what we find is that between now and 2050, across each of these 5 systems, we could start to see significant and rising impacts. We've examined a climate scenario that is RCP 8.5. This is essentially a higher emissions scenario between now and 2050. The reason we examined this scenario was to understand what we call inherent risk. What's the full, unmitigated, unadapted risk that different systems could experience? Not to be alarmist, but really to say what's the scale of the problem that we need to solve. And under this RCP 8.5, by 2050, which, by the way, is about a 2.5 degrees Celsius world, we find rising impacts across all of these systems. So, for example, when we look at livability and workability, we find that about 0.7 billion to 1.2 billion people could live in parts of the Earth that could experience about a 14% annual likelihood of experiencing a lethal heat wave. On the other hand, when we think about physical assets and infrastructure, we find that there could be an increase in damages from riverine flooding by about 4 times relative to today. And so across all of these systems, we have rising risk, we have non-stationary risk, and this matters for infrastructure, not just because infrastructure itself could be damaged as a result of these events, as we show on this slide, but infrastructure could also be a crucial part of the solution to manage these risks. So if we move to the next slide, what we identified through our research is 7 different characteristics of climate risk. And I think these are important for us to explore because they have quite profound implications as we think about infrastructure design. As I've described previously, what we find with our research is that physical risk is an increasing form of risk. We looked at 9 different case studies of different assets and sectors and geographies across the world. And across each of our 9 case studies, everything from the impact of heat and humidity in India to the impact of flooding in cities like Ho Chi Minh and Bristol, we find increasing impacts anywhere from 2 to 20 times between now and 2050. Every country we looked at could see an increase in at least one indicator of physical climate risk. Hand in hand with that is the fact that risk is non-stationary. Risk in the system today is not the risk in the system in the future. Climate science also tells us that regardless of what we do in mitigation, with mitigation, some amount of physical climate risk is locked into the system that we need to adapt and manage. And so as a result of that, what this means for infrastructure is the fact that we need to manage and design infrastructure not just for the climate of today, but particularly when we're putting down long-term assets, also for the climate of the future. So in the increasing nature and the non-stationarity of this risk is particularly important in the context of long-lived infrastructure assets. It's a spatial form of risk, as I described previously, and this means we need to bring a spatial lens as we think about making various economic, financial, design, engineering decisions. It's a nonlinear form of risk, as I've described, and this means as we think about adaptation investments, as we think about the weighing the cost and benefits of different forms of investments, it's important to understand the full magnitude of the damages that systems could experience without being appropriately designed. It is a systemic form of risk. Risk in one part of the world could spread to other parts of the world. Risk in one sector could spread to other sectors. And this, again, is particularly important for infrastructure because infrastructure is the backbone that all economic activity relies on. So infrastructure assets in particular being damaged could have multiplier knock-on effects in the rest of the economy. Infrastructure assets themselves could also both be impacted because of their own damages, but also because of other vulnerabilities in the system, other loads on the system that could disproportionately affect infrastructure. So for example, when we think about the power system, rising heat conditions, of course, make the power system less efficient, but they also increase the load on the power system. So there's both a supply and demand effect. So in particular, understanding the systemic nature of these climate risks, the multiplier nature of many of these risks is important as we think about infrastructure design. It is a regressive form of risk. The most vulnerable parts of the world are most affected. And this, again, is particularly important when we think about infrastructure because infrastructure systems, when appropriately designed, can help solve or address some of the regressive characteristics and protect the most vulnerable. And what we find across the board is that it's a risk we may be underprepared for. Both the pace and scale of adaptation across the board we find needs to be increased. So let me maybe close with saying essentially, if you move to the next slide, many people have said this, right? But essentially, the next decade is decisive, both as we think about decarbonization action and preventing, helping put the world on a 1.5 CO2C pathway. And infrastructure is a crucial part of that. I'll come back to that point. It's also a decisive decade as we think about preparing for unavoidable hazards. The fact that some amount of warming is locked in means that we need to start to prepare now to manage that locked-in increase in risk we're likely to see. And so if we move to the next slide, just to close on the role of infrastructure in managing mitigation, as I said, the next decade is decisive as we think about decarbonization action and managing for the buildup of risk. And infrastructure is a crucial part of that solution. If you look on the right here, this is essentially showing the breakdown of emissions across a range of sectors. And we've highlighted 3 sectors, building, transport, and power, that essentially contribute a substantial portion of overall emissions. And these are essentially infrastructure assets. So not only do we need to design infrastructure to be resilient to the climate of the future, decarbonizing infrastructure is also a crucial part of preventing further buildup of risk. So with that, let me hand over to Brody to take us through some more specific implications for infrastructure.
Great. So now we'll dive into the kind of focus on the infrastructure system and what physical climate risk means for the infrastructure system. If we go to the next page, that we're going to talk about a few different things, right? And this is the overall paradigm we talked about that needs to be adopted in order to manage climate risk. One is just actually understanding that risk with some granularity, understanding how that risk shows up, for example, in a diversified portfolio of infrastructure assets or kind of the built environment of a given city or state or country, the risk that we're exposed to as citizens, as investors, right? So really kind of understanding that climate risk. Second is how can we adapt? Both how can we adapt existing infrastructure assets to changing risks and some of the thresholds that Michaela talked about, but also how can we use infrastructure to help support our societies in adapting, right? Infrastructure is at least part of the solution to a lot of the climate risk challenges that we're facing. And then third, how can we decarbonize, right? So how do we actually reduce the emissions of, or use infrastructure to reduce the emissions of the broader economy? We're going to do another couple polls, so get your polling minds ready. A couple of things. So the first question, and this question is, feel free to again interpret it in your own context, right? But the question is, have your assets been impacted by physical climate-related events, and was that impact material, right? So Michaela talked about the difference between physical and transition risk. This question just focuses on the physical risks. Were there, and we can open the polling now, unless if we haven't already. Oh, it's already halfway done. So, yes, and with significant financial impact, or yes, but there was a flood, but the financial impact wasn't that great. If you don't necessarily own a portfolio of infrastructure assets, you're from an academic institution or so on, then just think about your own organization, right? Has your organization been disrupted by these physical climate events? And was that disruption material? Interesting. So a pretty even split. So, call it, a quarter of folks saying yes, and with significant financial impact, basically an even split across the three questions. Why don't we actually go to the next poll, and we can open this up now. So the exact same question, except this is a focus on transition risks. And let's as you answer this question, think about transition risk broadly, right? So has there been kind of regulation that has impacted infrastructure that you're kind of in touch with? Has there been changes in consumer behaviors, changes in technology, and other kind of systems that have impacted your infrastructure assets or the kind of organizations you're with, and what's that impact material? And maybe as folks, as we're kind of running out the time in responding to this poll and then hearing the results, also feel free to kind of put questions in the Q&A box. We'll kind of continue with the presentation, but if there are questions that come up, we're happy to pause as we go and take those. I know there's a lot of folks on the line right now, so hopefully there's a few people with some questions. All right, so let's see the impact of transition risk. So in physical risk, because it was about an even split across the three responses. In transition risks, about an even split across the three responses. So again, pretty even across the three in terms of both the exposure or the impact, impact of a particular transition risk and whether that was material, right? So let's actually kind of move on to the next part of the discussion. This is kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about physical climate risks is, what are the infrastructure systems? So you'll see here, this is some analysis we did in the research that we've done over the past year. What are the actual infrastructure systems what are the physical risks? And, there are a few kind of pieces of input that we looked at in developing this analysis. So one is just, what is the actual hazard? So are droughts increasing? Are hurricanes increasing? Is extreme heat increasing? The second is, what is the exposure? So that is, that's asking the question, are there airports that will be exposed to rising sea levels or to hurricanes, to these physical hazards? Where are the rail systems? Where is the wireless infrastructure? And then the third is, what is the actual vulnerability? So Michaela talked a little bit about these kind of non-linear breakpoints in infrastructure systems. So you remember that chart that you showed? That was actually, a kind of stylized view of a train station and the damage curve of a train station, right? And you had essentially a dynamic where a little bit of water created a little bit of damage, a little bit more water created a little bit more damage, and then a little bit more water. Once you passed a certain kind of threshold, it, basically approached replacement cost of the asset, significant damage to the asset. And essentially what we did is we looked at those three factors. We looked at all the different hazards and whether they'd increase. We looked at all the different infrastructure assets and whether they were exposed to those hazards. And then we looked at the actual damage or vulnerability of those assets, both in engineering terms. So what are the physical, engineering thresholds that those assets have? And then also in economic terms, once those thresholds are crossed, what's the actual impact? Does it shut down the asset? Does it have a pretty big, financial impact or kind of other impact for the asset and the folks that benefit from that asset? And I think just a couple observations. I know this is a lot to look at, but just a couple observations to call out here. So one is just that, as we looked at the broad infrastructure system and the broad set of physical hazards, we found that almost every infrastructure system was exposed to some severe hazard or some hazard that would have a pretty material impact on that infrastructure system. So for example, if you're looking at this page, the transmission and distribution system being exposed to risks by wind, by wildfire. I mean, we've seen the results of that live over the past several months. If you look at the air transportation system and its exposure to storms, there's the exposure to flooding. So every infrastructure system has some type of serious exposure to physical climate risk. The other kind of lens to look at this from is, as your own organizations are thinking through, hey, what do we actually need to focus on? Sometimes just the range of physical climate risks and, for some organizations, the range of their assets and their geographies makes it very hard to do an efficient look at physical climate exposure. And so what we often do is just start with this kind of approach, right? A bit of a top-down approach where we say which are the physical climate risk effects, which of our infrastructure systems, and how can we prioritize within that. So go to the next page. I see there's a couple questions coming in. Okay, we'll get to there's a question just around how do conventional risk management practices have to change to account for the risk that Michaela talked about. So Michaela, maybe I'll ask you to kind of answer that question in a minute, but why don't we just dive in here quickly. So then you kind of deep dive into parts of that map that we just talked about, parts of that chart that we talked about. This is a deep dive in the impact of extreme heat on global air travel. We looked at both the actual kind of technical thresholds of, in this case, regional aircraft and most airports, and examined the extent to which they'll be exposed to increased heat, the frequency with which that increased heat will pass those technical thresholds. So basically, when it gets too hot, some aircraft can't take off, right? Or they need a really long runway to be able to take off, or they need to take off all of their, out of all of their cargo and passengers to take off. And we found that by 2050, just south of 200,000 airline passengers per year will be grounded due to extreme heat. That's about a 23 times increase relative to today. In 2050, by 2030, so 10 years from now, about a 10 times increase in flight groundings due to heat. Now, a couple things to note about this. One is just that, as a share of global airport or airline groundings or passenger groundings, this isn't a huge share, right? This isn't, 50% of the passengers that are grounded every year. There are groundings due to technical issues, mechanical issues, and just late flights and all these types of things. But it's very concentrated in a few main hubs. So, right, it's concentrated in some big hubs like in Delhi, other parts of the kind of Asian subcontinent. It's concentrated in the southwestern United States. And so for many of those airports, this is actually a pretty material impact on the reliability of air transportation through those hubs. It'll have impacts on the economics of the airlines. It'll have impacts on the economics of the airport. And importantly, it'll have, impacts on the connectivity of those cities to the world and the economic, we know how important that is for those cities' economies, right? So, just as one vignette on the impacts of physical climate risk on infrastructure. Nicola, do you want to answer the question the question is, how do conventional risk management practices have to change in order to properly account for the 7 characteristics that you talked through?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think Brody will talk about it a little bit in the context of infrastructure specifically, but I think at the highest level, there's 2 or 3 things that need to be done differently. I think the first is that oftentimes our risk management models are based on backward-looking data. For example, when you think about insurance, it largely relies on actuarial data. And so we now need to start to switch that to take into account forward-looking models, forward-looking climate science, and an understanding of how the climate is actually likely to shift going forward and not just rely on backward-looking data and models to do analysis. So that's one. The second is taking into account the non-stationary characteristic of these risks. So what that means is as we're designing systems today, as we're thinking about risk management today, particularly when it pertains to long-lived systems and assets, it's important to not just think about their risk today, but what risk could look like over the lifetime of the entire asset because of the changing nature of these risks. The third, as I was describing a little bit, is to take into account this sense of geography, right? So oftentimes risk models and risk management practices don't really look at space. We do a lot of work more broadly assessing a variety of risks. And as we think about things like supply chain risk, maybe that's the one place where people do have some sense of, or do take into account some sense of geography when they think about modeling. But even there, as we've talked about climate change with a variety of companies as they think about supply chain risk, this notion of the climate actually varying across geography, the need to understand exposures by region is a relatively new trend, a new phenomenon. So very important to think about geography. And then finally, as we think about our own approaches to risk management, I think it's important to recognize a shift in mindset that needs to take place. I think some of the characteristics of climate risk that I described related to the nonlinear nature of climate risk means that we need to think about modeling both in terms of the quantification itself, but also combine qualitative understandings of risk with quantitative understandings of risk, because you could imagine a whole range of scenarios going forward as we think about risk assessments that are beyond the historical sample that we've experienced to date. We're also experiencing this a little bit with the pandemic, right? The scale of change and the scale of impact in economies is really something that most people living today have not ever experienced in their lifetime. And I think similarly for climate risk, it's important to understand that the nonlinear and systemic nature of these risks means that we may need to widen our aperture and approach to risk management to really build robust, thoughtful, qualitative scenarios to combine with quantitative modeling and analysis.
Great. And I see some other questions coming in, which is great. So we'll kind of talk about the next couple of pages, and then we'll hop to the questions as well. So if we go to the next page, this is another deep dive on a different type of risk, right? So we talked about heat in airports. This is talking about flooding and kind of a diverse set of infrastructure across an urban infrastructure system. If you're curious, there's a full kind of report out about both Bristol and we also did the same exercise in Ho Chi Minh. And Bristol and Ho Chi Minh are relatively different cities, which is why we chose the two. Bristol floods today, right? So if you think it's on a river, if you think about a 200-year flood, today, and there's a quick question, which I'll answer quickly. There's a question around whether these figures are all based on RCP 8.5. They are. So both the airport case that we just talked about and these are all based on RCP 8.5. Today, if you look at Bristol, we essentially mapped the infrastructure system in Bristol, right? So where are the substations, where are the roads, where's the rail lines, all the different infrastructure features of Bristol. And then we kind of simulated a major flood of Bristol based on a 1 in 200 year flood. And today you have flooding, right? So you have low-lying areas, often rural, that flood. There's some flooding in the harbor, relatively limited overflow of the harbor flooding into the nearby industrial areas. Maybe some water touching some power assets, but unlikely that it would have major disruptions of those power assets. If you fast forward, though, to the next page, which is 2065, and you look at the increase in the severity of 1 in 200 year event given climate change, it's a very different story for Bristol, right? So you have a major gas power plant is flooded and basically shut down. The main port area is totally inundated, so completely underwater. And the industrial areas that surround that port, an interesting fact about Bristol is it has the UK's largest new car storage inventory at the port in Bristol. And when you talk about these threshold points, new cars are no longer new cars once they flood, right? So they lose an enormous amount of value, and the flooding would in a 1 in 200 year event in 2065 would flood all those cars and have a pretty significant damage. The major substations, the power's significant chunk of Bristol is flooded, likely disrupted, and then you have some of these interesting knock-on effects. So, for example, there's a main central business district in Bristol that has a lot of high-value headquarters, and it's not flooded. But all of the transportation arteries that allow people to get in and out of that area are flooded. And so you'd essentially have a disruption of all of those operations for the period of the flood and whatever period of recovery. Same with the train station. So while the train station may not be flooded, the infrastructure that feeds it is flooded. And this is when we talk about kind of paradigms in kind of changing our risk management paradigms, this is one of the really critical parts of changing that risk management paradigm is so much of the risk is due to these systemic effects. And so, often if someone says, well, my train station's far above water, but if the rail line's not, it doesn't really matter. And there's a bunch of, analogs of that throughout the infrastructure system. If we go to the next page, so what does that actually mean in terms of damage? You have about a 13 times increase in real estate damage and destruction, 17 times increase in infrastructure damage and destruction, whatever you want to call it in terms of increase in infrastructure service interruption, and then, 22 times increase in the knock-on effect. So call it somewhere between $500 million and $3 billion in damages of that kind of flood in the future. Given climate risk. And this is a city that, yes, it has some flooding today, but is not a large emerging, city on the water, or kind of on a seafront subject to storm surge. This is a relatively moderate case of increased flood risk. Why don't we go to the questions? So there's one question around where we see good examples of governments planning and improving infrastructure, taking climate risk into account. So I think a lot of the examples that we see which are most promising are those that are done closest to the risk. And what I mean by that are cities, right? And cities are often, at the front lines of these physical climate risks. They're often operating the infrastructure assets. They are, they're kind of the first line of defense when a major acute event happens. And so I think cities have often been at the cutting edge of doing this work. A few things that we've seen cities do. So one is just build up a pretty, in some cities, obviously not all cities, but some cities building up a pretty kind of compelling climate risk modeling capability. So really understanding and updating all of the kind of disaster prevention, disaster modeling and response capabilities to take into account the shifting curves that Nicola described, right? So instead of it being backward looking and say, these are the areas that typically flood, being forward looking and thinking, well, these are the areas that might flood or that we might have extreme heat or wind, one of these physical hazards in the future. A second thing is just some really kind of creative approaches to urban resilience. And, so for example, there's an example in Paris of using all of the playgrounds as, making sure the surfaces are permeable, making sure they can double as, flood catchment areas in the case of a flood. And that does a number of things, right? That obviously, in the case of a flood, allows you to mitigate the damage from that flood. But it also, by making the surfaces permeable, kids are playing on grass instead of concrete. And, it has a kind of multi-outcome effect instead of just managing the climate risk. And I think a lot of the best practices are ones that do that, right? That find, how can we not just build a big wall, but how can we invest in really, creative, resilient infrastructure that allows not just a prevention of a disaster, mitigation of the harm from that disaster, but improvement in the day-to-day lives of our citizens. And then there's another question here around from a utility perspective, what kind of climate risk modeling, economic impact tools have you seen being used in order to justify climate hardening to the regulators for capital expenditure? This is a great question, one we get a lot. So for those who aren't kind of utility experts, basically many utilities have to, ask their regulators, whether it's a state government or whatever, to make significant capital investments in, their utility system. And without the regulators approving that, they either make those investments to their own, at their own expense and cannot pass it on to the rate base, or they just don't make those investments. And this has been a challenge. I think some of the things that we've seen, it's essentially really solid physical risk management tools. So we've seen a southeastern U.S. utility that did a pretty comprehensive assessment of changing risks of storm damage from the kind of Gulf or kind of from the Atlantic storm systems. And they basically did, really deep physical risk modeling and used all the climate science and the climate modeling, layered that over just in the ways that we just discussed, layered that over their infrastructure grid, and talked about, there's a whole bunch of specific things in a transmission system. So it really matters what angle the wind is blowing relative to the transmission line. If the wind is blowing along the transition line, it's very unlikely to be disrupted. If it's blowing orthogonal to it, it is very likely to be disrupted. So all that kind of granular modeling, did the physical modeling, build that into the economic impact of that modeling, and particularly for the regulators, talked about what that meant in terms of disruption to the consumers of the energy that utility was providing. And we're successfully able to, get some allowances to put investments on in adaptation into the rate base. So that is, a bit of an answer to that question. Nicola, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Maybe if I could just make two quick adds. So firstly, on the point about government action, I think Brody, you summed it up well. I think the one thing I would say is, that particularly with emerging markets, and I come originally from India, I think there's a real opportunity as you think about new infrastructure builds. So many emerging economies are likely to be investing a large amount of capital in the coming years as they think about building out infrastructure assets. And so, this is not just about making existing infrastructure more resilient, but also really thoughtful planning about forward-looking infrastructure. And then the question on the utility modeling, I think the key is indeed getting the detailed modeling that Brody was describing right. And there's a variety of tools and assets, as Brody was describing, that allow us to do really robust climate risk modeling and impact analysis. But I think equally important is also this notion of understanding the systemic points of failure in an infrastructure system. I think Brody was giving the the example that probably all of us can wrap our heads around the train station, right? So a specific train station may be elevated, but if there's flooding in another part of the track, that impacts train lines. So just as we think about modeling some of these impacts, it's important to take the full system view and not just necessarily think about the direct asset and its exposure to damage, but other points of failure that could also affect the operation of the asset.
Yeah. There's a couple other questions. Let me just super quickly go through a couple of next points, and then let's just focus on the questions, right? So what can we do about it? I think we talked about this at the outset, which is, I think Michaela talked a bit about this paradigm shift in managing climate risk, so I won't go over that again. Why don't we go to the next page? One point we wanted to make is a bit of the good news side of the story, right? And the good news side of the story is that if you are if you're in the infrastructure system, if you're anyone in the infrastructure system, we have a really critical role to play in addressing this problem. So a critical role to play in addressing adaptation, in really preventing, the worst harm to our economies, our societies, the people in them from these climate risks. And a really critical role to play in mitigation, so in decarbonizing. We've done research, this is an example of the opportunity. This is broadly, right, but, 3 to 5 trillion in sustainable investment opportunities by 2030, plenty to go around, for folks who are interested in, starting businesses, making investments here. That includes mitigating and adapting to climate change. And if you look at the breakdown, which, we don't talk about here, but just on the bottom, if you look at the breakdown, as Nicola mentioned at the outset, a significant chunk of this is in infrastructure, right? It's in power, it's in transportation, it's in carbon management. So there's just an enormous opportunity for the upside in helping this transition. And then in the next page, infrastructure also has a critical role to play in decarbonization, right? So we've done some research on what it would take to get to 1.5C across sectors. And, if you look at, for example, emissions reductions, power, transportation, these over 100% decarbonization numbers are interesting because they imply some negative emissions, but like some capture, but, power, transport, et cetera, buildings all have a pretty critical role to play. Why don't we stop with the presentation there? A couple of quick responses to questions. So there's one around, how realistic and secure are the effects due to the uncertainties in modeling? So absolutely, one of the things that Michaela was mentioning is, we try to stay away from kind of point estimates here. It's this is a probabilistic thing. I will say just anecdotally that, we've done a lot more work on this outside the context of this public report with clients. And, even in different climate risk, scenarios, different emissions pathways, the materiality of these risks remains constant, right? So while the specific numbers may change, the materiality of these risks for most different asset types and so on, it still exists. I'm just trying to scan through the questions. Nick, I don't know if there's any. Go for it.
Yeah, just add to that point. I think I mentioned this in passing at the start of the discussion around RCP 8.5. Just to reiterate some of that, right? So RCP 8.5, I know, has been criticized as being an unrealistically high emission scenario. But firstly, I think it's important to remember that much of that discussion is for the second half of the century, not to 2050. I think the second thing that's important to remember is that between now and 2030, all the emission scenarios are essentially projecting roughly similar amounts of warming, and that's largely, as I described, to do with the amount of emissions that are locked into the system. And then I think thirdly, the important thing to remember with the scenario we described is it's essentially about a 2.5 degrees Celsius world by 2050. So as Brody was saying, with other scenarios, we may end up by 2050 having less amount of warming, but it is all of these scenarios essentially push that amount of warming out by 10, 15 years. So I think it's also important to contextualize this maybe less so in terms of the RCP, but also as a benchmark in terms of this is the type of damage you would expect in a 2.5 degrees Celsius world. I would also say that the uncertainties related to the modeling in my mind are less about the emissions pathway, but more about us thinking about the knock-on effects and some of the damage quantification, which is where adaptation measures, true systemic risk, the presence of nonlinearities could mean there could be large ranges in the magnitude of impacts you experience. Yeah.
There was one question around discussing some of the more advanced successful financing models for resilient infrastructure. I'm going to answer with a non-answer, which is that, I think this is the kind of front lines of this whole debate, right, is how do we actually pay for this? We talked about the challenge with utilities. This gets even more important. I think there's a lot of arguments to make within an infrastructure portfolio, trying to make it more prepared for climate risk. I think the math often, checks out in terms of if you're an infrastructure investor with a portfolio that has some exposure, making investments in adaptation, you often are going to recuperate that either in the lifetime of your hold period or in an exit. And so I think for that, the math checks out. I think the challenge is, making those investments that are in broader adaptation across a full system. So, classic example of flood wall for a city, or some kind of green infrastructure to wetlands to prevent flooding for a city. And I'll just do a little bit of an advertisement. I mean, we're gonna be working on this over the next several months, and would love to speak with a number of folks on this and share ideas and try and create some innovations on this front. So I think that is the next front in this whole discussion. I know we only have 1 minute left. I would, obviously love to continue the conversation. Please feel free to contact Makela or I. As you can probably tell, we're very kind of enthusiastic and, committed to this discussion. And so we'd love to speak with anyone, to hear from you all, hear your ideas and share going forward. Thank you all for joining. And I guess we'll talk to you later. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Brody and Makela. That was fantastic. We hope you found this session very informative. And for all of our participants, we appreciate you joining. And we would appreciate if you would share your feedback during a 1-minute survey, which will appear just when you close your console. Thank you again. Thank you, presenters, and have a wonderful day.